Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a lonely little girl who could do anything she wanted. She didn't have a proper name. The doctor just gave her a letter and a number, E001. But her mother and father, the ones she loved dearly, called her Eveline. She could hurt people. She could turn them into monsters or make them see or think or do whatever she wanted. But her mother and father kept her safe and happy, so she never had to do those things. Until a great storm came, and Eveline learned on that dark night that her parents didn't love her anymore. They weren't really her mother and father in the first place. She learned she was alone, and that would not do. When the ship they were on crashed into the bayous of Dulvey, Louisiana, Eveline and her fake mother, her not mother, were pulled from the wreckage of the ship by a kindly old man and taken into his family's loving arms. Eveline had finally found somewhere she belonged, a family to call her own, and she decided she would never let them go, ever again. And that's how it all began, a sequence of events that would become known in the BSAA official records as the Dulvey Incident. But you might know it as Resident Evil 7. Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers, to a video I wanted to make for a very, very long time. Let's talk about something that I've been dreaming about for years. It's now being closer to actually coming true someday. Resident Evil 7 as a licensed chapter for Dead by Daylight. Regardless of what you think of any individual game, Resident Evil is one of the most interesting game franchises of all time when you look at the series as a whole. It's a series perpetually caught in a tug of war with itself. On one hand is a desire to constantly innovate and evolve what Resident Evil means by shifting the tone, setting, cast and mechanics to keep each game fresh. On the other hand is an addiction to nostalgia, the crutch of tried and tested formulas to ensure guaranteed profits by giving players more of what they already enjoy. The perfect example of Resident Evil nailing the blend of nostalgia and innovation, in my opinion, is Resident Evil 4. By bringing back fan-favourite characters like Leon, Ada and Wesker, Capcom was able to maintain continuity between RE4 and prior Resident Evil games. But there's a lot of unique elements to RE4 that just hadn't existed in Resident Evil prior. The setting shift to a more rural location, the merchant system, ditching viral zombies in favour of parasitised locals, and a general push towards more of an action shooter vibe were all totally new, not just to Resident Evil, but to the horror game landscape as a whole. This combination made RE4 both a lauded successor to the prior games, but also a trendsetter for the Resident Evil series to come, as it pushed away from horror in favour of each game becoming more actionised than the last. Capcom hasn't always gotten the balance between nostalgia and innovation right though. The remake of Resident Evil 3 is a textbook case of a game poisoned by its refusal to try something new. Despite my soft spot for the game, it's not hard to see that it's pretty much the neglected child of the original RE3 and the immensely popular RE2 remake, which came out just a year prior. It is just the original RE3 with some bits cut out and run through the RE engine that powered RE2 make. Aside from the redesign of Nemesis, there's not really a lot to remember about the RE3 remake that doesn't involve comparing it to one of these two games, usually negatively. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have probably the most unique Resident Evil title ever made, the one that effectively saved the franchise from the hell of mediocrity RE6 consigned it to, and gave rise to RE's triumphant return to survival horror. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. RE7 took what Resident Evil had been up to that point, chained it up in the basement and left it to rot. The game was run on a brand new engine with updated graphics, there was less emphasis on action, the conflict was smaller scale, the cast was entirely new, the horror elements were back in force to make it the scariest RE game ever, and it was even in first person, something no RE game had ever done before. And the game was a colossal hit. The RE engine would be used in every Resident Evil game since. The shift in tone to a truer horror experience carried over to the remakes of RE2 and 3, and the new cast, camera angle and approach to subgenre horror would all return in Resident Evil 8, and appear to have set the standard for future Resident Evil content to come. In case you can't tell, I'm pretty fond of this game to say the least. It's my favourite horror game of all time, and in a recent list I made, it's probably my second favourite video game of all time, behind only Batman Arkham City. And as such, when I made a video back in April last year covering the potential Resident Evil have in Dead by Daylight, I extolled the many virtues of RE7 as my ideal source material for a hypothetical Resident Evil chapter. I acknowledged that classic characters like Nemesis and the Raccoon City crew were more likely to make it into the game, something I turned out to be completely right about. But I didn't let that spoil my dreams. Once the full RE chapter got released in the summer of last year, I pretty much accepted defeat and moved on. Until the anniversary livestream gave us something special. For the first time ever, we were getting a sequel to a licensed chapter. Resident Evil Project W was announced, bringing us Albert Wesker as the killer and Ada Wong and Rebecca Chambers as the survivors. I've already documented my thoughts on Wesker, but this revelation got me, thinking. We just had a second RE chapter. Who's to say we can't get a third? In this video, I'll be talking about why I think a third Resident Evil chapter based on the newer games isn't just possible, but actually quite likely, why I think Resident Evil 7 is the perfect choice for adapting into Dead by Daylight, and finishing off with a power and perk concept for my dream killer, the immortal psychopath and family man, Jack Baker. Before we continue, I'd like to talk about something very exciting. On Monday I'm doing my channel's first ever subathon on Twitch to celebrate 2 years since my first upload. We'll be starting off at 3 PM GMT, and there's some really exciting stuff planned out. You can make me play twins without hooking, make me play zombie only Nemesis, or even make me make a FNAF video, because, you know, why not? It's 3 PM GMT at the Twitch channel linked in the description, and I can't wait to see you there. Anyway, back to RE7. Now let's start with an important question. Why did we ever get a third RE chapter in the first place? There's a pretty simple answer. I'll give you a clue actually. It's Capcom's favourite word and it rhymes with honey. Worth remembering, the first Resident Evil chapter made an absolutely disgusting amount of money. The player count for Dead by Daylight has never been higher than when the Resident Evil chapter came out. And the upcoming release of Project W is also highly anticipated and will possibly outsell even the first chapter, with how positive the reception to Ada and Wesker has been. As a result, the financial incentive to keep going would definitely still be there. RE7 would be the ideal candidate for the next chapter, because RE7 made an absolutely vile amount of money as well, and did so quite recently while being a massive critical success, and basically saving Resident Evil from the rut of mediocrity it had been in for quite a while. According to Capcom's Platinum list, RE7 is the best-selling RE game of all time, and the second best-selling Capcom game of all time, behind only Monster Hunter World. Jack Baker and the Fat Molded are also set to return in RE-verse as playable bioweapons, so there's clearly still love for the game by both audiences and Capcom. I mean, he's the true front and centre on the posters. They obviously consider Jack's presence in the game to be a significant selling point. The killer and survivor choices for the second RE chapter suggest to me that a third chapter is something Capcom and Behaviour are at least considering. Because if you think about it, if you were Capcom and Behaviour and wanted to make money off of more RE chapters, why would you bother with a killer from a 13-year-old game that isn't currently making any money when you could add characters from your brand new games that are making you money right now? Unless you could do both. I don't see a universe where they add an old character to the game and don't even consider a new character to go in that slot unless the door was open to both of them making it in at some point. Resident Evil getting a third chapter hinges on Capcom wanting it and the prior RE content making enough money to justify a third slot. I suspect both of these things would be quite likely if the second chapter does as well, or perhaps even better, than the first did. So let's assume that's going to happen and a third chapter based on modern RE is going to take place. Which characters would we get? A great place to start would be to look at the options we have for a killer. Resident Evil 7 has 4 villains. The 3 Baker family members, Jack, Marguerite and Lucas, along with Eveline, the bioweapon responsible for sculpting the Baker family into her murderous minions. I'm just going to come right out and say it, Jack is the obvious and best candidate here. Lucas and Marguerite can be discounted pretty much immediately. Lucas has the least focus in the main game, acting more like a Jigsaw-style serial killer who constructs games and traps to torture and kill his victims. He gets a bigger presence in the Not a Hero DLC, where he becomes the main antagonist scrapping it out with Chris Redfield, but I still think he treads too much on the actual Jigsaw killer that's already in Dead by Daylight and doesn't represent RE7 as a whole very well. Marguerite, on the other hand, is styled like a hive queen of the bayou's insects, and only transforms into anything resembling an actual serious threat when Ethan confronts her in a boss battle at about the game's halfway point. Both Marguerite and Lucas suffer being secondary villains. They lack focus and only have a single boss fight each to really show what they're made of, even if I'd argue Marguerite has the best boss fight in the whole game. While Marguerite especially could have a really interesting power, I think they'd both be poor representations of what the game has to offer if they were chosen as killers. Eveline would be a solid candidate, as the main game's overarching villain and final boss, but Eveline's problem is simply a lack of actual presence. Eveline spends most of RE7 either as an old lady in a wheelchair due to accelerated aging, or as a hallucination induced by Ethan's exposure to the mould. Eveline would lack the physicality needed to do the things a DVD killer needs to do. Break pallets, pick up survivors, open lockers, that sort of thing. Sadako has shown us what behaviour can do with a killer who never touches survivors physically, but Eveline basically never even moves. She'd be a lot harder to suspend disbelief for, especially since she's a hallucination most of the time anyway. Jack, on the other hand, is the single biggest presence in Resident Evil 7 by far. Even from the start of the game, Jack is presented as the biggest threat Ethan has to overcome, and the most active force out to get him, even if he's not strictly the biggest villain in the game. If Eveline is Emperor Palpatine, then Jack is her Darth Vader, her enforcer who forms the main opposition to our hero, and steals the spotlight from his more narratively important higher up due to that direct opposition. And it shows, because Jack is one of the most fought bosses in Resident Evil history. Counting the DLCs but not the pursuit encounters, Jack has 5 boss battles throughout Resident Evil 7, which is a number matched only by Birkin in the original RE2 and Nemesis in the original RE3. Yep, this man has fought more than Mr. X, more than the remake Nemesis, more than Albert fucking Wesker, more than all 4 of the Lords in RE8 combined. He even outlasts Eveline and Lucas to become the final boss of the whole game when he's finally killed by his brother Joe in the End of Zoe DLC. RE7 is Jack's game, and he's the ideal candidate to represent it in Dead by Daylight, and it becomes particularly obvious when you look at his design inspirations. While Lucas is based quite unsubtly on Jigsaw, and Marguerite is kind of a riff on a classic witch or shaman, Jack is based on old school slashers, the primary source material and enduring lifeblood of Dead by Daylight. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the most obvious inspiration, but unlike the hillbilly, Jack is more based on the cook Drayton than he is on Leatherface. He also reminds me of Jack Torrance or a Louisiana version of Mick Taylor, if anyone ran his scene Wolf Creek, and even makes the Evil Dead reference at the start of his second boss fight. Jack was made by a team that loved horror, just like Dead by Daylight, and it's only fitting that the two come full circle and Jack make his appearance in the game. Perhaps now would be a good time to address the large vampire lady in the room, and talk about the only real competition RE7 has for a third Resident Evil chapter. Resident Evil Village, the newest game in the franchise. I know a lot of people really want some representation from the new kid on the block, especially the, well-liked Lady Dimitrescu, and I understand why. The Dead by Daylight community is terminally horny. Like, the developers made a dating sim and body pillows to get you guys to calm the fuck down horny. And as soon as she was revealed, Orsina Dimitrescu more or less caused the entire internet to resonate with a war cry of "Step on me" by hundreds of thousands of very thirsty gamers. All jokes aside, we've never had a vampire killer before, and I'd fucking love to see one come to Dead by Daylight. There's a lot to love and be excited for about the potential for Lady Dimitrescu in Dead by Daylight, and I wouldn't necessarily hate her. But there's a couple of issues with adding her. The biggest one by far being that she's barely in her own game. Like, she has to share the spotlight with the other 3 Lords and Mother Miranda, which is a problem when she's the one who dies first. Even if you argue that Moreau and Beneviento's segments are shorter than Orsina's, and as a result she kind of upstages them, I don't think that can be said of Karl Heisenberg, the German-inspired industrialist and werewolf pack leader who's the last of the 4 lords to be dealt with. His factory section of the game is as long as Alcina's castle, if not longer, and his power set is something completely unique to Resident Evil as he's given a Magneto-like ability to manipulate metal. If you wanted to make a Resident Evil 8 chapter, you'd have to contend with the fact that the killer that everyone would want existed more as a marketing tool to put in trailers and on standees than as an actual antagonist in the game where she had to jostle with 4 other villains for the spotlight. And the lack of good survivors, but we'll get to that later. This becomes more obvious when you look at what she actually does. Her skill set that we converted into a power in Dead by Daylight. She has, nothing. At least nothing beyond just being big and having sharp fingers before she transforms into her dragon-like boss form. Like, I'm sorry, but that's really not enough to make a functional power from. They'd even have to cut down on how big she is so she'd be able to fit through things like doors and window vaults. They did it with Nemesis, and at 9'6", Alcina is even taller than he is. The only unique thing I think she could bring to the table would be her daughters as minions of some sort. But we all remember what happened last time they tried to adapt a Resident Evil pursuer into Dead by Daylight and gave them friends to help out their power, right? One Nemesis is bad enough already, we don't need 2. Actually, wait, here's an idea. Make Lady D a legendary skin for Nemesis. Both of them are giants who fight with their hands, and you could reskin Nemesis' zombies to be the hooded Moroika from that section of the game. Her boss form even has tentacles. I could absolutely see it, and in my opinion that would be way better than allocating a full chapter to her. Jack, on the other hand, where to begin with him? Despite sharing his game with 3 other villains, Jack remained distinct enough to be the inarguable face of RE7, and his repeat appearances as a boss give us lots of fuel to adapt a power from. A lot of people have suggested giving him the chainsaw shears from his second boss fight in the dissection room, but we already have 2 chainsaw killers. I don't think that's the best representation that RE7 could give us. To come up with a unique and faithful power for Jack, I suggest that we look at the DLC End of Zoe, where Jack becomes the final boss of RE7 as he fights to abduct his daughter Zoe from the Umbrella scientists who are trying to treat her infection. After Evelyne's death, Jack becomes the head of the moulded hive mind in her place, sicking mold-infected alligators and moulded soldiers on his older brother Joe. To be clear, while I did base my power design for Jack on his appearance in End of Zoe, I think his visual appearance in-game should still look like he is at the start of the game, with the yellow dinner shirt and the sharpened shovel, to make him look more human and more recognisable, as opposed to the more monster-like Swamp Man design. A power that highlights that unique relationship between Jack and the Mold's hive mind would be a great way to bring RE7 into Dead by Daylight, and provide a potentially fun spin on the infection systems that both the RE killers prior have featured. But what could such a power actually look like? As is customary for my Prevention and Problems video series, I have a power concept ready to show you the kind of thing I mean. So strap in, because it's what I'm actually quite proud of. Jack Baker, otherwise known as the Moulded, comes with the power Evelyne's Gift.
My little girl has given us a gift, and this gift is with me always.
Jack begins the trial with 10 mold tokens, which regenerate at the rate of 1 token every 20 seconds. Whenever Jack vaults a window, opens a locker, snuffs a boon totem, damages a generator, or breaks a pallet or wall, he can spend a mold token using the power button to contaminate it with mutamycete, which will remain on the interactable as it matures. Injuring a survivor will also leave mutamycete on the floor where the injury happened. Mutamycete will mature into black mold in 25 seconds. Survivors can remove mutamycete in an action that takes 4 seconds, but cannot interact with black mold once it's matured. Once black mold is matured, Jack can use the activability button to activate an interactable or obstacle affected by black mold. What it will do when activated depends on what the object is, and then removes the black mold from the object. Molded interactables, so generators, totems and lockers, will spawn a moulded hand to pin any survivors interacting with it for 8 seconds, pausing progress on the objective where applicable and revealing Killer Instinct to Jack. The survivor would be stuck to the generator they're working on, the totem they were doing, or pulled inside the locker they were inside or standing near. Moulded obstacles, those being windows, broken pallets and broken walls, spawn black mold blockages at the obstacle location that cannot be moved through or vaulted for 5 seconds. Think of it like a bamboozled window, blood-favoured dropped pallet, or intact breakable wall. Black mold that grows from injuries, i.e. floor mold, becomes black mold portals at the end of the maturing time. Jack can teleport from one black mold portal to another, destroying the one he left from. And that's my Jack power. I've had this concept running around my brain for about a year now, but I thought now would be a great time to show it off. His weapon would be his sharpened shovel he wields early in the game, and his Mori would be the execution he pulls off on the deputy in his garage. I've got a list of add-ons here too. I'm not going to bother reading them all out, but you can always just pause the video and take a look at it in your own time. I'm really proud of some of the ones I come up with. My line of thinking for this whole power was playing up Jack's unique role as part of Eveline's hive mind, and taking inspiration for the mold's effects on the Baker house when figuring out how to reflect that in Jack's power. Look, I know getting affected by a bioengineered pathogen is kind of Ari's whole deal, but I think Jack offers an interesting twist on the formula. Plague, Nemesis and Wesker all have powers revolving around spreading infection directly to the survivors. Why not have power that contaminates the map itself? Because Eveline is the head of a hive mind composed of the mold spore she generates, basically everything in Resident Evil 7 is a part of Eveline, and the game documents Eveline's spiralling lack of control over her surroundings as the medication the connections were giving her to control her powers became unavailable. This caused Eveline to age from a 10-year-old girl into an immobile old lady in just 3 years, and caused her control over her adopted family to lapse more and more frequently, to the point that both Lucas and Zoe were able to break Eveline's control permanently. These lapses in control resulted in the mold growing rampantly on its own as she became more desperate to hold everything together. You can see this happening throughout RE7. Hallways and rooms that start out as clean and domestic, at least by the Baker family standards, start spilling mold out from every nook and cranny like the Baker house itself is desperately trying to patch itself back together. That's the vibe I wanted to capture with Jack's power. The idea of the mold setting itself in deep into the entity's realm, and Jack being its shepherd and right hand. Speaking of the realms, why not a map based on the Baker estate? Let it be clear, I don't think the main Baker house itself would be a good map in its entirety. It's way too claustrophobic. A lot of killer powers would be completely unusable in all the tight corridors. But I do think the Baker estate as a whole has the potential for a really sick map. I'll take you on a little tour and map out the parts of the estate that I would use. Let's start off with the garage with Ethan's wrecked car. You stick a generator in here, and if you want to access the top bit, you could put a flight of stairs leading up to it, but honestly, I'm happy to just leave the garage more or less as it is. Then we head out through the garage into the dining room and hall area. Maybe you stick a window vault between the dining room and the kitchen, and have this wall remain knocked through so you can access the corridor from either the dining room or from the hole in the back. Then we head through the ox door into the main hallway. This could be like a nice little central bit. You leave the interior doors locked, but you pop a generator upstairs, have your window vault up there, have that as a little kind of central spot to do looping in. And then you've got the door leading out to the old yard. Out in the yard, you can put a keep outside on Lucas's door so you can't go in there. And maybe put the generator in the trailer. But if you can do that, you want to probably tear off the roof on some of the sides so you can access it from more than one angle. Maybe put a window vault at the back just to make it a bit more interesting. You don't need to go to the old house so you can collapse the footbridge that leads to it, but instead have the rest of the map be the old greenhouse, the boss area where you fight Marguerite. I'm imagining this is something similar to like a 2-story version of Shack, maybe like Cold Tower main building sort of. So at the end of the day, you have a half indoor, half outdoor map with a kind of second little main building at the back. Pop one exit gate at the garage door and the other one by Lucas's area or beyond the greenhouse, and then we've got ourselves a map. And to round it off, let's talk about survivor options, because that's where I think RE8 really starts to struggle. RE8 has a lot of villains, some could say too many to pick out a single one to duck into Dead by Daylight, but it has basically no survivor options whatsoever. Like, the only new characters you meet are a random woman who dies in a fire like 5 minutes into the game, and the Duke, who's a great character actually. Seriously, the Duke might be my favourite merchant in any video game besides maybe Tom Nook, but probably isn't up to the task of being a survivor and looks to be a malevolent force in the upcoming Shadows of Rose DLC for RE8. The only new survivor I think RE8 could provide would be the adult version of Ethan's daughter Rose Winters, as she appears in the Shadows of Rose. And since that DLC isn't out yet, there's not a lot I can say about her character. 7 doesn't have a massive cast either, but you've at least got a few more options. Ethan Winters as the player character of both RE7 and Village is the obvious pick, but there's a big issue with him. Capcom will not reveal his face under any circumstances. They don't show it in 7 or 8 in the RE8 model viewer, and it'll even be shadowed in the upcoming Resident Evil 8 third-person mode in the near future. I don't think that's going to change. And I'll be honest, I don't think that's feasible for a survivor in Dead by Daylight. Behaviour want a guy without a face, and Capcom won't let Behaviour give him one. So I'm pretty sure the chaddest dad in Resident Evil doesn't have a snowball's chance in Dead by Daylight. However, RE7 also introduces Ethan's wife, Mia Winters, who would fit the bill much more closely as a survivor. Mia worked for the Connections, a company similar to Old School Umbrella that manufactured and maintained Eveline. She was Evelyn's handler and mother figure during her time with the Connections, and took it upon herself to put Eveline down for good when the Annabelle, the ship that was carrying Eveline, crashed in the bayous, but failed and wound up captive by Eveline and the Bakers. She's playable for a little section of RE7 and is typically portrayed as more stable and professional than her husband, which is a shame because RE8 more or less stuffed her in the fridge, treating her as dead for most of the story to give Ethan the emotional push he needs to save Rose. I firmly believe Mia deserved better in 8 than to be effectively killed off and kept in Miranda's hideout for the entire story, only to just reappear at the end so that Rose is her mother after Ethan dies. In any case, she's criminally underused in 8, one of 7's most interesting characters, and would be a great pick for Dead by Daylight. Other options from 7 include Zoe Baker, the daughter of Jack and Marguerite, who helped Ethan escape and fight back against her family, Clancy Jarvis, the cameraman of the Swamp Gators film crew, who is the player character of the banned footage DLCs, and Joe Baker, the protagonist of the End of Zoe DLC and older brother to Jack, who beats up Mulder with his bare hands to rescue his niece from the clutches of her resurrected father. Whether these would be legendary cosmetics for other characters or as their own survivors, I don't really mind. But Mia, Rose, Zoe, Clancy and Joe would all be good candidates to make it into Dead by Daylight someday. My personal pick, if I had to choose one, would be Mia. I've even taken the liberty of prepping some perks for her and Jack that I think would fit. Give me your thoughts on the following in the comments. Mia Winters comes with 3 perks. Till the bitter end. You know how to keep your head in a crisis and help others do the same. When another survivor is in the struggle phase, you see the killer's aura when you are within 60 meters of the hook, and you unhook 40, 45, 50% faster. Your teammates receive the same benefit when you were in the struggle phase. 11th hour. When the chips are down, you know when to take action. When you're holding a blinding item, you see the killer's aura if both you and the killer are within 8 meters of a downed survivor. The blindness effect from blinding items you use lasts 30, 40, 50% longer. Spare supplies. When you find yourself in an unfamiliar environment, you'll find something to lend a hand. When you're at an open, empty chest with an empty item, Spare Supplies activates. Press the activability button to put the item back in the chest, where it will also regenerate charges until you return to pick it up. And we've got some killer perks too. Scourge Hook Biohazard. Nothing you touch remains unspoiled for long. When a survivor is hooked on a Scourge Hook, the item charges deplete at a rate of 1 charge per second. When a survivor becomes unhooked from a Scourge Hook, they are afflicted with Broken for 20, 25, 30 seconds. Mind your manners. You refuse to allow trespassers to run rampant in your territory. Whenever you pick up a survivor, the last generator they worked on becomes blocked for as long as you are carrying them. The block persists for 6 seconds once the survivor is hooked. Mind Your Manners has a 40, 35, 30 second cooldown. Slaughterhouse Rules. You're always craving a good fight. Whenever a survivor takes a protection hit, the survivor they took the hit for becomes the obsession. Whenever a survivor who is not the obsession is put into the dying state, the obsession and all survivors within 16, 20, 24 meters of the obsession have their aura revealed to the killer for 5 seconds. I hope you can tell by just how much I've done for this video that more than any other licensed chapter, this is my personal pipe dream. And with the announcement and incredible positive reception of a second RE chapter, that dream is closer than it's ever been before. If Capcom and Behaviour see a mutually beneficial relationship that continues to prosper when Project W releases, I see no reason why either party would want to stop there. And Resident Evil 7 would be an incredibly sad opportunity to miss because that game changed everything. It changed the way Resident Evil presented itself going forward, as both the remakes and sequel that followed it would veer back towards the survival horror roots of RE, a move started by 7. The mold story in 7 is core to understanding 8. The move to first person is something that RE developers wanted from the very first game, and Jack is a refreshingly human take on the pursuer enemy type we've seen in RE before, and remains one of the most charismatic and sympathetic villains in the series. Resident Evil 7 and Dead by Daylight were made for each other, and I can hope the next time Capcom and Behaviour end up in the boardroom together, that a strange house with a weird family out there in the Louisiana bayous doesn't get forgotten. So that's everything I have to say about a potential third Resident Evil chapter for Dead by Daylight. Suffice to say, I would be over the moon if this was to happen someday, but what do you think? Do you think this is likely? Do you think I'm insane? Is this something about another killer that I'm not considering? Let me know in the comments. I always love to hear discussions going on. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe if you like what you saw, ring that notification bell so you don't miss future uploads. You can also check out the links in the description to join my Twitter, to check out my Discord server, and my Patreon if you feel like my content is worth your money. Patrons get to see my content a day early, so if you want to be part of the early access gang, the link is right down there. Also my Twitch is down there, where we'll be doing a subathon for the first time on Monday, 3 PM GMT, so do pop along, it's going to be a really exciting time. While you're down there, there's also a link to Wraith Energy, long-term partners of the channel, who make the energy drinks upon which my battered psyche will rely on during the aforementioned subathon. Their drinks are delicious and provide sugar-free energy without the crash. Interested in picking some up for yourself, the link is there in the description, and you can use my code PICK20 for 20% off at checkout. Gets you some nice energy drinks, supports the channel, everyone's a winner. So, guess I'll see you on Monday. Ta-ta for now.